In the early decades of the 19th century, inheritance was not simply a matter of property. It was a matter of survival, of family name, of political standing, of social legitimacy. In the rural American South, where vast plantations defined both economy and hierarchy, lineage was treated as currency. Land could be purchased. Labor could be forced. But bloodline had to be secured. At Hawthorne County's edge stood the Whitmore Estate, a sprawling property bordered by tobacco fields and river-fed marshland. The house itself, constructed from imported brick and lined with tall white columns, had been built not only to endure but to be seen. It was meant to communicate permanence. Inside those walls lived Margaret Whitmore. By most accounts, she was educated, composed, and outwardly devout. Letters preserved from distant relatives describe her as measured and well-spoken, though rarely warm. She married Thomas Whitmore at 19. He was 27, already overseeing thousands of acres inherited from his father. The match was strategic, two families consolidating wealth, influence, and expectation. Within the first year of marriage, questions began quietly. By the third year they were no longer quiet. Margaret had not produced an heir. In plantation society, this absence carried weight far beyond the private disappointment of a household. It threatened continuity. Without a legitimate son, the Whitmore estate would fragment through extended relatives and contested claims. Land could be divided. Influence could dissolve. And so the problem, as it was described at the time, became Margaret. Medical understanding was limited, but social judgment was not. Doctors were summoned discreetly. Remedies were prescribed: tonics, diets, rest cures. Margaret complied. Servants later recalled that she moved through those months with rigid calm, attending church, managing household staff, writing careful correspondence. No public sign of distress. Privately, the pressure intensified. Thomas Whitmore faced scrutiny from neighboring landowners. Conversations shifted tone. There were suggestions, some subtle, others less so, that perhaps the issue lay not with Margaret but elsewhere. Yet in a society structured by male inheritance, blame settled predictably on the wife. The word Barren entered circulation. It was not spoken openly in her presence. It appeared instead in whispers, in letters, in the pauses between polite inquiries. Barren. A word that reduced a woman to function. A word that implied deficiency not only of body but of purpose. Records suggest that by the 5th year of marriage, Thomas Whitmore's demeanor changed. He became more insistent about securing an heir. Legal drafts were drawn up and redrawn. Provisions were considered for distant nephews. None satisfied him. It was during this period that plantation practices shifted in ways not immediately obvious. Like many large estates of the time, Whitmore's property relied on enslaved labor. Families were recorded in ledgers not as kinship units but as assets. Ages, strengths, skills, all meticulously catalogued. Births were noted with particular attention, as they increased the estate's value. But sometime in the early 1830s, a different kind of notation began appearing. Select women of childbearing age were reassigned from field labor to domestic proximity. Their housing was relocated closer to the main quarters. Pairings among the enslaved population were subtly encouraged or rearranged. Outwardly, this could be interpreted as routine management. Plantation owners often calculated labor growth through forced reproduction. It was an unspoken reality of the system: human lives reduced to generational investment. Yet at Whitmore Estate, the pattern was unusually deliberate. Midwives were consulted more frequently. Infants born within certain quarters were documented separately. Thomas Whitmore took personal interest in the health of specific households, an attention he had never previously demonstrated. Margaret remained publicly composed. There are no surviving diaries that reveal her private thoughts. What exists instead are accounts from those who worked within the house. They describe her increasing withdrawal. Fewer public appearances. Longer hours spent alone in the east parlor. Curtains drawn more often than before. One house servant, interviewed decades later, described a moment that lingered in memory. Margaret standing at an upstairs window, watching as an enslaved woman, heavily pregnant, was escorted across the courtyard under supervision. The servant could not recall Margaret's expression, only that she did not look away. The birth records from that year show a rise. Infants were born into bondage, as was tragically common. But among them were 2 boys who received unusual attention. They were not granted freedom. They were not acknowledged as anything beyond property. Yet they were housed in quarters closer to the main residence. Their health was monitored with care rarely extended to others. Speculation, of course, followed. Plantation society thrived on unspoken knowledge. Neighbors observed patterns without addressing them directly. It became increasingly clear that Thomas Whitmore had devised a solution to his problem, one that preserved public decorum while ensuring biological continuity. The details remain obscured by time. No document states explicitly what was understood privately. But lineage historians later noted striking physical similarities between the Whitmore line's later descendants and certain individuals once recorded in slave registries. Margaret's role in this arrangement remains the most complex question. Was she complicit? Powerless? Strategically silent? Within the rigid structures of her world, her options were narrow. Divorce would have ruined her standing. Public accusation would have collapsed the estate's reputation. Compliance, silent, outwardly dignified compliance, may have appeared the only survivable path. Yet survival often demands a cost. Servants reported that Margaret began insisting on personally overseeing baptisms of enslaved infants born on the property. A small act, perhaps, but symbolically layered. She stood as witness to lives brought into bondage under circumstances tied to her own perceived failure. The community praised her piety. Thomas Whitmore, meanwhile, began preparing legal documents with renewed confidence. Wills were amended. Trust structures created. Language carefully crafted to ensure that issue of the Whitmore blood would inherit, without specifying maternal legitimacy. The estate stabilized. From the outside, the crisis appeared resolved. The Whitmore name would continue. Property would remain intact. Society could resume its comfortable illusions. But beneath that stability lay tension. Within the enslaved quarters, awareness spread. Women understood when their bodies were being calculated. Men understood when pairings were enforced for reasons beyond companionship. Resentment did not erupt. It rarely could, but it settled into the air like humidity before a storm. And inside the main house, Margaret's isolation deepened. In later years, visitors described her as austere, controlled. She spoke little of family. Portraits commissioned during that period depict her standing alone, hands folded, gaze directed slightly away from the viewer. Thomas Whitmore, by contrast, appeared satisfied. He hosted gatherings again. He spoke of the future with assurance. History often records outcomes, not methods. The Whitmore estate continued through the next generation. A son, publicly acknowledged as heir, assumed management after Thomas's death. His resemblance to the enslaved population was never addressed in official narratives. Margaret lived long enough to see him take control. When she died, her obituary described her as steadfast and devoted to the prosperity of her household. No mention was made of the years of scrutiny, of the whispers, of the solution that preserved the family name at the cost of others' autonomy. The system functioned as designed. But systems built on silence rarely remain untouched by consequence. Because what is forced beneath the surface does not disappear. It settles. It waits. It reshapes memory. And in the years that followed, subtle shifts would begin to emerge within the estate, patterns that could not be explained solely by inheritance or management. Something unseen had been set in motion. What silence builds in the dark. When a system solves a crisis by hiding it, the solution rarely stays contained. By the mid-1830s, the Whitmore estate appeared stable again. The ledgers were balanced. The fields yielded reliably. A boy, publicly recognized as Thomas Whitmore's heir, grew under careful supervision inside the columned house that had once felt uncertain of its future. On paper, the bloodline had been secured. But paper does not quiet memory. Within the enslaved quarters, knowledge traveled differently than in the main house. It did not require documentation. It moved through observation, through resemblance, through patterns of treatment, through the subtle distinctions in how certain children were handled compared to others. Two boys, born within months of each other, had been given unusual attention from the beginning. They were not freed. They were not acknowledged as anything beyond property. But they were watched closely. Their illnesses were treated promptly. Their education, limited though it was less neglected than that of their peers. The reason was never spoken. It did not need to be. Margaret Whitmore's presence in their early baptisms had not gone unnoticed. Nor had Thomas's periodic visits to the quarters under the pretense of inspection. Over time, servants and field workers formed their own understanding. The estate's future had been engineered quietly, and that engineering had required bodies that were never meant to carry legacy. The consequence of this arrangement was not immediate rebellion. It was recalibration. Enslaved families began adjusting their expectations. Pairings were no longer viewed simply as forced proximity or brief comfort. They were evaluated for risk. Women recognized that fertility could draw attention. Men understood that fatherhood might carry invisible implications. Birth, once a private mixture of joy and dread, became layered with calculation. The Whitmore heir grew into adolescence surrounded by deference. He was educated in reading, law, and agricultural management. Tutors were hired. Guests praised his composure. He carried himself with confidence that only inheritance can provide. Yet even as he assumed his role, something subtle distinguished him. Physical resemblance is not a crime, but it can be a mirror. Visitors occasionally remarked, always carefully, on the boy's darker features. On the shape of his jaw. On the texture of his hair. Thomas dismissed such comments with practiced ease. Margaret did not respond at all. But resemblance travels beyond appearance. The heir displayed an instinctive familiarity with the rhythms of the quarters. He navigated those spaces without the discomfort many young masters exhibited. He listened more than he spoke. He asked questions about crop rotations that suggested curiosity rather than command. This unsettled Thomas more than he admitted. Because what had begun as a strategy to preserve authority was now producing a successor who understood the estate from more than one vantage point. Silence had built something Thomas could not fully direct. The enslaved population noticed the heir's differences too. Some interpreted them as irony. Others as opportunity. Most simply watched. Watching became a quiet habit across the estate. It was during these years that a shift in labor patterns emerged. Tasks were completed efficiently, but with increasing independence. Workers anticipated inspections before they occurred. Repairs were made before complaints reached the main house. Information traveled faster within the quarters than through official channels. Thomas attributed this to discipline. In truth, it was adaptation. When people understand they are being used as instruments of continuity, they learn to read the structure that binds them. They study its weaknesses. They measure its blind spots. The Whitmore arrangement had unintentionally educated those it sought to control. Margaret's role during this period remains difficult to define. She retreated further from public life, yet she maintained a visible presence in rituals, church services, seasonal gatherings, household management. Servants described her as observant. She noticed details others overlooked. On several occasions, she intervened quietly when punishment was proposed for minor infractions. Not dramatically. Not enough to alter the system. But enough to signal restraint. Whether this was guilt, strategy, or self-preservation cannot be known. But restraint, once introduced, changes atmosphere. Thomas Whitmore, aging and increasingly focused on financial stability, failed to recognize how much the estate's cohesion depended on assumptions he no longer questioned. He believed the matter of succession had been solved permanently. He did not consider that legitimacy enforced through silence carries its own fragility. The first sign of structural strain came through external inquiry. A distant cousin contested part of the inheritance language in Thomas's revised will. The challenge did not accuse directly. It simply questioned phrasing, specifically the clause referring to issue of the Whitmore blood. The cousin requested clarification regarding maternal lineage. The request was procedural. Its implication was not. Thomas reacted defensively, tightening documentation, reinforcing secrecy. Lawyers were consulted. Language was refined again. But once a question enters legal record, it lingers. Whispers spread beyond Hawthorne County. Meanwhile, inside the estate, the heir's position became more complicated. He sensed tension without understanding its full origin. He asked fewer questions. He became more formal. Distance replaced curiosity. And distance, in a system built on concealed proximity, creates imbalance. The enslaved boys born alongside him had grown as well. Their treatment remained marginally improved compared to others, but never equal. They understood enough to recognize contradiction. They shared blood with the house that claimed superiority, yet remained bound to it as property. This awareness did not produce open defiance. It produced memory. Memory of who was valued and who was denied acknowledgement. Memory of how lineage had been secured. Memory of silence. Over time, that memory began shaping behavior in ways Thomas could not predict. Information about harvest timing, financial strain, and legal vulnerabilities circulated within the quarters with increasing sophistication. Workers learned to pace productivity. They met quotas precisely but rarely exceeded them. They corrected problems selectively. They allowed minor inefficiencies to surface when advantageous. Nothing rose to open resistance. But control, once unquestioned, now required constant reinforcement. Thomas grew more rigid. Inspections increased. Documentation expanded. Yet the estate's performance plateaued. It did not collapse, but it no longer excelled. Margaret watched this plateau with a stillness that unsettled her husband. She had once been the perceived flaw in the Whitmore narrative. Now she witnessed the unintended consequences of correcting that flaw through exploitation. Her silence, once protective, now seemed observational. As Thomas's health declined, the heir prepared to assume full authority. He inherited not only land and title but tension. He stepped into leadership aware that his legitimacy had been engineered. Whether he understood the full truth remains uncertain, but he understood enough. On the evening Thomas Whitmore died, the estate was quiet. There was no public scandal. No revelation. The bloodline continued as intended. Yet beneath the appearance of continuity, the arrangement that had secured succession had also redistributed awareness. Those who had been used to preserve legacy now carried knowledge of how fragile that legacy truly was. And knowledge, once internalized, alters power. The Whitmore estate would move forward under new management. It would continue producing, continue hosting gatherings, continue projecting stability. But the structure built in silence had begun shaping outcomes beyond its maker's control. Because when legitimacy depends on secrecy, every generation inherits not just land, but uncertainty. When what was meant to stay hidden begins to speak without words. Uncertainty rarely arrives as a single event. It settles first in tone, in hesitation, in the small gap between instruction and execution. Under the leadership of the new Whitmore heir, the estate did not immediately change. Outwardly, it maintained continuity. The ledgers were updated in his handwriting now. The overseers addressed him with practiced respect. Margaret, older and increasingly withdrawn, occupied a quieter corner of the house. But leadership is not inherited as seamlessly as land. The heir, Thomas Whitmore Jr., had grown up surrounded by privilege, yet shadowed by something unspoken. He knew, even if no one had ever confirmed it, that questions followed him. He sensed it in the way certain visitors paused before offering praise. In the way neighboring families evaluated him more carefully than they had his father. Legitimacy had been constructed for him. And construction leaves seams. Within the quarters, those seams were visible long before they were acknowledged in the main house. The enslaved population understood nuance. They had learned to read patterns out of necessity. They had observed how certain births had altered the estate's trajectory. They had seen which children received attention. They had noticed which topics silenced conversation among the white household staff. Now, with a new master in place, one whose resemblance did not go unnoticed, their awareness sharpened. It was not rebellion. It was analysis. Thomas Jr. approached management differently from his father. He favored observation over immediate discipline. He walked the fields without escort more often. He asked about yields directly from laborers rather than solely from overseers. This unsettled the overseers first. Because systems built on hierarchy depend on controlled channels of information. When the head of the estate bypassed those channels, even casually, it disrupted expectation. Small inefficiencies began surfacing in unusual places. A shipment miscounted by only a fraction, but enough to draw scrutiny. A section of fencing repaired before collapse, without a recorded order. Irrigation adjusted subtly in anticipation of a storm the overseer had not yet prepared for. None of these incidents constituted defiance. In fact, they improved the estate's resilience. But they revealed something unsettling. Foresight was operating independently of command. Thomas Jr. noticed. He began asking how certain problems were resolved before reaching him. The answers were always ordinary. We thought it best. It seemed necessary. It was time. The truth was simpler and more complex at once. Years of living within a system that manipulated bloodline had cultivated a kind of collective intelligence among the enslaved population. They understood timing. They understood vulnerability. They understood that power relied on the appearance of inevitability. And inevitability can be softened through precision. The estate's productivity remained steady, but its control felt thinner. Overseers complained quietly that workers seemed too coordinated. Not openly resistant. Not sluggish. But deliberate. As though decisions were being weighed beyond instruction. Thomas Jr., rather than responding with immediate punishment, hesitated. This hesitation marked the beginning of visible uncertainty. He had grown up benefiting from a secret arrangement. Somewhere within him, though he could not articulate it, lingered an awareness that the estate's stability had not been purely earned. It had been engineered. That awareness made him cautious about escalation. Margaret observed this with silent intensity. From her parlor window, she watched her son cross the courtyard toward the quarters more often than previous masters had. She saw the brief exchanges. The pauses. The way he sometimes stood longer than necessary, as if listening for something beneath the surface of conversation. What he was sensing was not accusation. It was knowledge. Knowledge that the estate's continuity had depended on people it refused to acknowledge as kin. Knowledge that resemblance carried meaning. Knowledge that silence, once weaponized, could be reclaimed. The first unmistakable moment of strain occurred during a regional gathering of landowners. Thomas Jr. attended alone, Margaret having declined to travel. Conversation eventually turned, as it often did, to succession and legacy. A neighboring planter, emboldened by wine and familiarity, made a remark about fortunate resolutions to unfortunate circumstances. The phrasing was ambiguous. The implication was not. Thomas Jr. did not respond publicly. But when he returned to the estate, something in his demeanor had shifted. He increased documentation. Requested audits of slave registries. Re-examined inheritance clauses his father had drafted. Questions he had once avoided now demanded examination. Within the quarters, awareness of this shift spread quickly. People adjusted. Productivity slowed, not dramatically but perceptibly. Tasks were completed exactly to requirement, rarely beyond. Efficiency that once protected the estate from scrutiny began to retreat. Not as punishment, as demonstration. The estate could function smoothly. It could anticipate risk. It could exceed expectation. But it chose not to, not without recognition. Recognition was not demanded openly. It manifested instead as withheld excellence. This was intelligence cultivated in the margins. Intelligence born from generations of forced adaptation, now shaping outcomes through restraint. Thomas Jr. felt the difference without fully understanding it. He sensed that control required more than authority. It required belief. And belief was fragile when built on silence. Margaret's health began to decline during this period. In rare conversations with her son, she spoke cryptically about structures that cost more than they appear to give. She never named the past directly. But her words carried weight. It is possible she saw what he was only beginning to grasp, that the estate's greatest vulnerability was not financial or agricultural. It was moral. Because legitimacy enforced through exploitation creates instability across generations. The second unmistakable rupture came through legal inquiry. The distant cousin who had once questioned inheritance language resurfaced, this time armed with genealogical research. Not accusation, yet. But implication sharpened through detail. Physical resemblance. Baptismal records. Housing proximity. Patterns too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Thomas Jr. realized then that the silence his father had relied upon was thinning. Inside the estate, this realization altered tone. Inspections increased again. Not with his father's severity, but with anxious thoroughness. Overseers were reminded of protocol. Movement between quarters was observed more closely. The enslaved population responded predictably. They complied. And they withdrew further. Information that once circulated to protect the estate's interest now remained localized. Repairs waited for formal orders. Storm preparation lagged by hours rather than days. Harvest timing aligned exactly with instruction, never ahead of it. The estate did not fail. But it no longer thrived. Thomas Jr. began to understand that what he faced was not rebellion, it was equilibrium shifting. For years, intelligence cultivated in secrecy had propped up the plantation's success. Now that intelligence was recalibrating its contribution, he could not command it back into alignment, because it did not belong to him. It belonged to those who had survived beneath the system long enough to understand it. Margaret passed away quietly that winter. Her funeral was modest, dignified. She was remembered as steadfast, devoted, resilient. No one publicly acknowledged the role she had played in securing the Whitmore line. But as the procession returned from the cemetery, Thomas Jr. looked out across the estate with new awareness. He understood, finally, that inheritance is not merely property transferred through legal document. It is consequence transferred through memory. The intelligence cultivated in the margins was no longer subtle. It was shaping yield, shaping efficiency, shaping the estate's public standing. And it was doing so without violence, which made it harder to confront. Because force can suppress action. It cannot suppress understanding. By the close of that year, whispers beyond Hawthorne County had grown louder. Questions about lineage approached formal challenge. Productivity, while steady, no longer impressed investors. Overseers reported unease they could not define. The structure built in silence was now influencing the estate openly, through absence, through restraint, through calculated compliance. Thomas Jr. stood at a threshold his father had never faced. He could double down on control. Or he could confront the truth beneath his inheritance. Either path would expose limits. When authority tries to tighten its grip. By the spring following Margaret Whitmore's death, the estate no longer felt merely unsettled. It felt observed. Thomas Whitmore Jr. carried that sensation with him as he moved through the main house, across the fields, and into the ledgers that had once represented stability. It was not open defiance he sensed. It was awareness. A watchfulness that did not flinch when he approached. He had inherited land, wealth, and command. But he had also inherited silence, and silence, he was beginning to understand, has a memory. Rather than confronting the origins of that memory, he chose a more familiar response. He tightened control. The first changes were administrative. Work logs, once reviewed weekly, were now examined daily. Overseers were instructed to document not only output but demeanor, who hesitated, who volunteered, who spoke more than necessary. Movement between quarters required written justification. Informal gatherings were discouraged under the pretense of efficiency. Lanterns were installed along pathways that had previously relied on moonlight. The estate grew brighter at night. Visibility, Thomas believed, would restore clarity. Instead, it exposed how little clarity had existed to begin with. Workers complied with the new protocols precisely. Too precisely. Reports were filled out in exact language, stripped of interpretation. If a tool broke, it was noted. If a storm approached, it was recorded. But anticipation, the quiet foresight that once shielded the estate from damage, vanished. The plantation became reactive. A fence collapsed because it had not yet been ordered reinforced. A drainage trench overflowed because the request for adjustment had not passed through proper channels in time. None of these failures were catastrophic. But they were cumulative. Thomas responded with renewed discipline. Punishments increased, not publicly severe but unmistakable. Infractions once overlooked were now cited. Delays once tolerated were recorded as disobedience. Overseers were reminded that authority must be felt to be effective. The result was order without trust. Within the quarters, a quiet recalibration unfolded. Intelligence did not disappear, it redistributed. Conversations became shorter in visible spaces and longer in private ones. Decisions were made with an awareness of surveillance. If initiative would draw scrutiny, initiative would wait. The estate's rhythm shifted from adaptive to mechanical. Thomas noticed the slowdown. He called meetings with overseers, pressing them for explanations. They blamed morale. They blamed distraction. Some hinted at outside agitation, though none could identify its source. But there was no outside force. The change had been cultivated within the estate itself, through years of silence, calculation, and inherited contradiction. The most telling moment came during harvest. In previous seasons, the fields had often surpassed projected yield by modest but consistent margins. Workers anticipated optimal cutting times. Adjusted placement based on soil moisture. Repaired storage space ahead of overflow. That year, yield met expectation exactly. Not more. Not less. On paper this appeared satisfactory. In reality it marked withdrawal. Thomas walked the fields himself, searching for signs of inefficiency. He found none. Every instruction had been followed. Every quota met. Every task completed. What was missing could not be recorded. He increased inspections. Storage rooms were searched without warning. Housing quarters entered at irregular hours. Private belongings examined under suspicion of concealed communication. Nothing significant was found. But something else was discovered, something harder to confront. The people subjected to inspection did not protest. They did not plead. They stood still, watching with expressions neither hostile nor submissive. It unsettled Thomas more than anger would have. Because anger confirms opposition. Calm suggests understanding. He began to suspect what he had once avoided considering, that the estate's stability had long depended on contributions never acknowledged in its hierarchy. That intelligence, once cultivated in secrecy, does not require permission to exist. In response, he attempted something more symbolic. He reorganized labor assignments, separating families who had grown close, dispersing individuals rumored to influence others. The logic was familiar: disrupt cohesion to prevent coordination. But cohesion at Whitmore Estate had never relied on proximity alone. It had relied on shared memory. Separation slowed communication, but it did not erase awareness. Tasks continued to be completed exactly to requirement. Problems were allowed to escalate just enough to demand official response. Opportunities to exceed expectation were ignored. The plantation became efficient only when directed. Meanwhile, whispers beyond the estate grew sharper. The cousin who had once questioned inheritance language began consulting legal scholars. Not to accuse directly, but to explore precedent. Questions of legitimacy, once confined to rumor, approached formal scrutiny. Thomas felt pressure from both directions, from within the estate's thinning loyalty and from outside its guarded reputation. He chose force again. Overseers were granted broader authority to discipline without prior approval. Night patrols doubled. Curfews tightened. And yet, nothing erupted. No rebellion. No open refusal. Only continued precision. The estate functioned at its narrowest definition of obedience. It was during this period that Thomas confronted one of the two enslaved men whose birth had once paralleled his own. The man was now grown, measured in speech, composed in bearing. Their resemblance, though muted by time, lingered in subtle features. Thomas asked him directly about disruptive undercurrents. The man responded evenly, "We do as we are told." The statement was true. It was also complete. Thomas realized then that enforcement had reached its limit. He could compel labor. He could impose rules. But he could not compel initiative. He could not force intelligence to align with his interests if it no longer chose to. The estate's greatest resource had never been land alone. It had been the unspoken collaboration between authority and those who understood how to protect it from itself. Now that collaboration had been withdrawn. Margaret's earlier words echoed faintly in memory, structures that cost more than they appear to give. The Whitmore solution, engineered to preserve bloodline, had created a generation raised within contradiction. That generation understood both sides of power. It understood how visibility could be manipulated, how compliance could be calibrated. An intelligence that has learned to operate without recognition does not return to obedience simply because authority demands it. By late autumn, the estate's financial margins narrowed. Not disastrously, but enough to attract notice. Investors asked questions about declining surplus. Neighbors remarked on the estate's newfound caution. Thomas could not punish his way back to trust. He could not surveil his way back to initiative. He stood on the veranda one evening as lanterns flickered along the newly illuminated paths, watching shadows move across the fields. The estate was brighter than it had ever been. And yet he felt more blind than his father ever had. Because once people understand the limits of power, those limits cannot be unseen. The Whitmore estate had attempted to reassert authority through visibility, enforcement, and discipline. What it revealed instead was fragility. When force exhausts itself. By the time winter settled over Hawthorne County, the Whitmore estate was still standing, intact in structure, disciplined in appearance. The columns of the main house remained white against the gray sky. The fields lay harvested in orderly rows. The ledgers were balanced with careful arithmetic. From a distance, nothing had collapsed. But inside the system, something had thinned beyond recovery. Thomas Whitmore Jr. had done everything a plantation owner was expected to do when authority felt uncertain. He increased oversight. He clarified punishment. He made visibility constant. He reinforced hierarchy. And still belief did not return. Belief, he began to understand too late, cannot be commanded. It must be shared. The estate's fragility surfaced not through rebellion, but through absence, through the gradual withdrawal of what had once made the plantation more resilient than its neighbors. Harvest margins narrowed further that year. Not dramatically. Just enough to require explanation. The fields produced what was demanded, but no more. Opportunities to maximize profit were left unrealized. Minor inefficiencies were allowed to accumulate until they required costly correction. Overseers reported satisfactory compliance. They did not report initiative. Thomas attempted to counteract this by offering incentives. Small privileges, limited rewards for increased output. But the response was restrained. Those offered modest advancement accepted it cautiously. Those excluded did not protest. The atmosphere across the estate was no longer tense. It was distant. Force, once applied repeatedly, had clarified expectations. People understood precisely what was required, and what was not. What was not required was loyalty. What was not required was protection of the estate's interests beyond obligation. What was not required was foresight. The Whitmore plantation had once benefited from quiet intelligence cultivated within its margins. Knowledge of weather patterns, soil behavior, interpersonal dynamics, and administrative blind spots. That intelligence had been offered without acknowledgement. It had protected the estate from its own rigidity. Now it was withheld. The cost of that withdrawal became visible in subtle ways. A storage barn developed structural weakness that no one reported until collapse was unavoidable. The damage was not catastrophic, but it was expensive. A shipment destined for a favorable market was delayed by hours that could have been prevented with advanced preparation. The loss was marginal, but noticeable. Each incident could be explained individually. Together, they suggested something more profound. The estate no longer anticipated its own needs. Thomas found himself walking the property more often at dusk, as his father once had. But where his father had walked with assurance, Thomas walked with uncertainty. He sensed coordination without communication. A shared restraint that did not require discussion. It was not defiance. It was equilibrium shifting. The two enslaved men whose births had once paralleled his own now occupied respected positions within the quarters, not officially recognized as leaders, but deferred to in quiet ways. Their counsel was sought in private conversations. Their opinions carried weight not because they claimed authority, but because they had lived at the intersection of the estate's contradictions. Thomas observed this with unease. He considered separating them again, dispersing influence as his father might have done. But he hesitated. Force had already demonstrated its limits. Each escalation had yielded diminishing returns. Meanwhile, external pressure intensified. The cousin who had long questioned inheritance language formally petitioned the county court for review of the Whitmore succession documents. The claim was not explosive, but it was public. It requested clarification regarding maternal lineage and the precise definition of issue of the Whitmore blood. The estate's private silence was now brushing against public record. Thomas responded with legal defense. Lawyers were retained. Documentation fortified. The case moved slowly as such matters often did. But reputation once questioned shifts subtly. Neighbors began to regard the Whitmore estate with careful distance. Invitations grew less frequent. Financial partnerships cooled. The plantation was no longer viewed as unassailable. Inside the estate, awareness of the legal challenge circulated quickly. And something changed. For years, intelligence within the quarters had been defensive, focused on survival within constraint. Now it recognized vulnerability above. The withdrawal deepened. Productivity continued. Orders were followed. But there was no effort to shield the estate from its own exposure. If legitimacy would be contested publicly, it would not be defended privately by those it had never recognized. Margaret's absence was felt most acutely during this period. Her quiet interventions, her subtle balancing of tone, had once softened the estate's harshest edges. Without her, the house felt colder. Decisions felt sharper. Thomas began to grasp a truth his father never had. The Whitmore solution to barrenness had preserved bloodline, but fractured foundation. Because inheritance secured through exploitation does not erase the memory of exploitation. The unraveling was not dramatic. There were no flames, no uprisings, no singular collapse. Instead, there was attrition. Overseers resigned, citing opportunity elsewhere. Skilled laborers slowed under the weight of exhaustion. Investors diverted attention to more stable enterprises. The estate remained operational, but diminished. One evening, Thomas stood in the upper hallway where his mother had once watched from the window. The courtyard below was quiet. Lanterns glowed along the paths he had ordered illuminated years earlier. He realized then that brightness had not restored clarity. It had only exposed how much had always existed beyond his sight. The intelligence cultivated in silence had not attacked the estate. It had simply stopped protecting it. And without that protection, the plantation was left to operate exactly as its hierarchy dictated, rigid, reactive, and brittle. Force had not restored belief. It had accelerated withdrawal. The Whitmore estate did not collapse overnight. It declined through precision, through exact compliance that revealed how much it had once depended on unacknowledged contribution. The greatest fragility was not economic. It was relational. Power had mistaken control for consent. It had mistaken silence for agreement. It had mistaken engineered bloodline for secured legacy. Now, stripped of informal cooperation, it stood alone with its authority. And authority, when unsupported, grows heavy. By the close of that year, Thomas understood that the estate's future would not be decided solely in courtrooms or fields. It would be decided by what endured beyond enforcement. Because something had survived the tightening grip of power. Something that force could not command back into alignment. The Whitmore estate did not end with spectacle. There was no singular day of reckoning, no dramatic confrontation that marked the precise moment authority dissolved. Instead, its decline unfolded with the quiet inevitability of something that had long been weakening beneath its own certainty. The court challenge lingered for nearly 2 years. Depositions were taken. Language was dissected. The phrase "issue of the Whitmore blood" was examined with a precision that would have unsettled the family patriarch had he lived to see it. In the end, the legal decision did not strip Thomas Whitmore Jr. of his inheritance. It did something subtler. It required clarification. The ruling acknowledged the legitimacy of succession under existing state law. Yet in doing so, it entered into record the circumstances under which that succession had been secured. The arrangement, once private, managed within the walls of Hawthorne County, became documented language. Not accusation. Not condemnation. Documentation. And documentation changes permanence. From that moment forward, the Whitmore lineage carried not just continuity but context. Thomas retained the estate, but the aura of inevitability that had surrounded his authority thinned further. Investors became cautious partners. Neighbors offered polite distance rather than admiration. The plantation remained operational, yet no longer exemplary. Inside its boundaries, however, something more lasting had already shifted. The two men whose lives had once intersected so directly with the estate's hidden arrangement were no longer young. They had grown into adulthood under scrutiny and distance. They had watched the tightening of oversight. They had witnessed the legal challenge. They had observed how quickly authority had moved to defend itself. They had also observed something else. They had seen fear. Not fear expressed openly, but fear embedded in urgency, in Thomas's heightened inspections, in the constant reassertion of rules, in the insistence on visibility. Authority had revealed that it required defense. That knowledge could not be undone. Within the quarters, conversations no longer centered solely on survival. They began to include speculation about change. Not rebellion. Not violence. But inevitability. The estate's greatest illusion had been permanence. Now permanence felt conditional. Thomas sensed it. He felt it in the measured tone of responses. In the efficiency that bordered on detachment. In the way instructions were fulfilled exactly as given, never beyond. He tried, in his final years managing the plantation, to soften certain policies. Small gestures. Adjusted workloads during poor weather. Limited educational allowances for the younger children within the quarters, justified under the language of productivity. But gestures cannot erase structure. The Whitmore estate had been built upon hierarchy so rigid that even benevolence felt transactional. Margaret's portrait remained in the main hallway long after her passing. Visitors often commented on her composure, her calm expression. Few understood the quiet negotiations she had once conducted within those walls, the balancing of legacy against conscience. Thomas sometimes paused before the portrait in the evenings. Not out of nostalgia alone, but out of a recognition that she had understood something he had only come to grasp too late, that intelligence cultivated in silence does not disappear. It waits. Years passed. Economic shifts rippled across the South. Soil that had once yielded abundance required increasing intervention. Markets fluctuated. The national conversation around slavery grew more strained, more volatile. The Whitmore estate was no longer at the center of regional influence. It had become one plantation among many, its distinctiveness diluted by reputation and time. And yet, beneath that diminishing prominence, something endured. The children born in the quarters during those uncertain years grew up with knowledge their parents had guarded carefully. They understood the estate's contradictions. They understood lineage and law. They understood how authority could be both absolute and fragile. Education, though restricted, found subtle pathways. Literacy passed quietly between hands. Scripture readings doubled as lessons in language. Numbers learned in ledger observation became arithmetic practiced in secret. The intelligence that had once protected the estate now cultivated independence from it. Thomas aged into a quieter version of himself. His inspections became less frequent. His voice lost its sharp edge. By the time illness confined him to the main house for extended periods, the estate operated largely without his direct oversight. And it did not collapse. That, perhaps, was the final revelation. The plantation functioned not because of his authority, but because of the collective knowledge that had always sustained it. When Thomas Whitmore Jr. died, the estate passed to a more distant relative. The transition lacked ceremony. It was administrative. Papers signed. Titles transferred. The new owner arrived with confidence and reformist rhetoric. He spoke of modernization, of restructuring, of renewed discipline. He did not fully understand what he had inherited. Because what he inherited was not merely land and buildings. He inherited memory. Memory of arrangement. Memory of exposure. Memory of fragility. The Whitmore estate's greatest failure had not been the legal challenge, nor the rumors, nor even the gradual economic decline. Its greatest failure had been misunderstanding what could not be controlled. It had believed that bloodline secured loyalty. That surveillance restored belief. That force reinforced permanence. But what endured was not obedience. What endured was awareness. The quiet knowledge that authority, once examined, reveals its limits. Years later, when broader social upheavals reshaped the South, the Whitmore plantation did not withstand the transformation with distinction. It fractured along the same fault lines that had long existed beneath its surface. Some who had lived and labored there left at the first real opportunity. Others negotiated new terms in a changing world. The land was subdivided eventually, portions sold to offset debt accumulated through decades of diminishing yield. The columns of the main house weathered. Paint peeled. The illusion of grandeur faded into architecture. Yet in oral histories passed quietly through generations, the story of Hawthorne County lingered, not as scandal but as lesson. A family that sought to secure legacy through control. A system that mistook silence for stability. An arrangement designed to preserve a name, yet ultimately documenting its contradictions. The Whitmore bloodline continued in various branches, dispersed across counties and states. Some descendants carried pride in ancestry. Others carried questions. But the plantation itself, its certainty, its authority, its belief in unchallenged permanence, did not survive intact. Because exposure had not been the true undoing. Exposure had only revealed what was already fragile. What endured, long after authority lost its certainty, was intelligence cultivated in the margins. Intelligence that outlived the system that attempted to contain it. And in the quiet spaces where Hawthorne County once stood as a symbol of unbroken lineage, the deeper truth remained. Power can enforce obedience. It cannot command legacy. Legacy belongs to what survives it.